Hi team, welcome to part 2 of externalities as a form of market failure. So in part 1, we had a really good look at what externalities are. We gained an understanding of the difference between positive and negative and production and consumption. So make sure coming into this video that you feel like you've got a handle on the 4 different types of externalities, and it's helpful if you have an example that is attached to each one of them. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the way that governments can intervene to either reduce or remove the externality and in turn reduce or remove the market failure such that social welfare is optimized, such that allocative efficiency is maximized, and obviously market failure is reduced as much as possible. So to get started, we're going to look at the individual types and then we're going to look at the ways that governments can respond. So let's get started with negative externalities of consumption. So if we talk about cigarettes for a moment, as per our previous video, we know that there's an over-allocation of resources towards the consumption of cigarettes, and as a result, Q1 is deemed too high. So key economic terms that you want to make sure that you're using, there's obviously a negative impact to a third party that is not involved in the transaction. And as a result, that leads to an over-allocation of resources towards the consumption of a product such as cigarettes. So how do governments intervene, right? Going back to this microeconomic diagram, we're assuming no government intervention. So if you think about the world in which you live, you know, cigarettes are very highly regulated. So you've got to kind of unwind and think, hang on a second, I need to assume that there is no indirect taxation. There is no legislation. There are no rules. There are no plain packaging laws, none of that, right? So what could governments do in order to encourage the Q1 to move from, say, Q1 to Q2? Q2 being obviously less than, because if we're able to reduce Q from Q1 to Q2, i.e. shifting Q to the left, we should see that over-allocation of resources being addressed. And so these are some of the options that the government has available to them. First and foremost, indirect taxes are often used to address negative externalities. So going back to your understanding of indirect taxation as per microeconomics, we know that that increases the cost of production for the producer. So the government levies a tax on the production of a particular good, in this case cigarettes, that leads to an increase in the cost of production for producers. That's going to shift our supply curve to the left. And so you can imagine if the supply curve is shifting to the left in this market, it will create a new equilibrium point somewhere around here, and the corresponding Q2 will be less than Q1, which implies that resources are reallocated away from the production of cigarettes, and that primary issue associated with the over-allocation of resources towards cigarettes is addressed. In that case, reducing the externality. Another option for the government in respect to negative externalities of consumption is regulations. So we're talking about laws and rules that obviously dictate who can and can't consume the product. And once again, with cigarettes, a really good example is the age limit that is associated with smoking cigarettes in Australia. So you need to be over the age of 18 in order to purchase cigarettes. And again, coming back to our microeconomic diagram, what that will do is shift the demand curve to the left. Now, the reason for that is that if all the market that was 18 years and younger that was previously purchasing cigarettes, they're now being legally told they can no longer do that. So that segment of the market is effectively gone, and that would shift the demand curve to the left. And once again, the corresponding new equilibrium point would be associated with a smaller Q. And then the final one listed here is negative advertising. So in Australia, if you think of something like the Quit campaign, you know, all the advertising material that you've been exposed to over your life to warn you of the smokers of danger, that's all designed to reduce your tastes and preferences towards smoking, such that it also supports a decrease in demand and has a very similar outcome to regulations that we just spoke about. So all these solutions, I suppose you can think of them as being solutions. They are basically designed to shift either supply to the left or demand to the left, ultimately to create new equilibrium points that provide a new Q. That Q being to the left of Q1, which, going back to the whole issue of externalities, is going to address the over-allocation of resources towards it. Now, it's not perfect, okay? It's never going to fully eliminate it, and there are a whole bunch of pros and cons associated that you can go deeper with if you'd like to. You don't necessarily need to know them for this course, but this is by no means a silver bullet. Plenty of people still smoke. You know, you still inhale secondhand smoke no matter where you go, but these are just some measures that can be used to mitigate, not completely eliminate, but to mitigate the issues associated with the negative externality to the third party not involved in the transaction. The next one I want to look at, guys, is negative externalities of production. So again, a very similar issue here. At Q1, we have an over allocation of resources, that is land, labor, capital, and enterprise, towards the market for manufactured goods, as an example, because manufactured goods are associated with CO2 pollution, and we know of all the negative impacts that has, for our environment and our living standards and so on and so forth. So the government now needs to come in and find some solutions that, once again, are going to shift demand to the left or supply to the left, such that the new equilibrium points that are created are corresponding with a lower Q, once again Q2 being smaller than Q1 to address that initial over allocation of resources. So if we look at negative externalities of production, and I'm going to use pollution as this example here, some of the ways governments could respond could once again be an indirect tax. So if you think about a carbon tax for a moment, we don't have a carbon tax in Australia, but lots of countries, particularly in the European Union, do. There is a tax, an indirect tax associated with the release of CO2, and that is designed to create a cost that businesses need to incorporate into their cost of production when they obviously emit CO2, and that leads to that increase in that cost of production that shifts the supply curve to the left, very similar to what we saw with cigarettes. Regulations, so governments can once again use regulation to manipulate supply and demand. For example, enforcing minimum environmental protection standards that force suppliers to dispose of waste responsibly. So potentially rules around how much CO2 you are allowed to emit, how much waste you are allowed to pump into the associated rivers, that kind of thing. And then finally, subsidies. Now, this one's new. We haven't looked at it yet. Obviously, you've looked at it in micro, but not with respect to externalities. And this is a situation where the government may subsidise a cleaner substitute, right? So payments made by the government to firms, that's what a subsidy is, and that's designed to reduce the cost of production. So the government could subsidise cleaner energy alternatives to help reduce their price and encourage consumers to substitute away from the non-renewable energy. So subsidies are interesting. Subsidies are not going to impact this market, right? It's as in the subsidy is not applied to this market. The subsidy gets applied to the substitute product. So some kind of renewable energy or, production process that leverages renewable technologies such that they are no longer associated or reduce pollution. And so if the government subsidizes something like that, it's going to cause the supply curve to shift to the right. And so more resources go towards that market. And so as a producer, you might look at it and go, oh, that type of energy is cheaper. I'm going to use that instead. And so instead of using the non-renewable technology that pumps more CO2 into the air, you might then utilize the renewable energy source that obviously does not have as much CO2 associated with it, ideally. And so if we go back to our microeconomic market for a moment, we could see the demand curve in this particular market shift to the left because the attention in that market is being substituted towards the renewable product, right? So that's a situation where you're talking about substitute products. The government subsidizes the one that is more economically friendly, environmentally friendly, and so that should support a reduction in the demand of carbon intensive production processes. Guys, another one we can look at in respect to externalities is obviously our positive externalities of consumption. Note the change in language. We looked at negative externalities of consumption and production. We are now looking at positives. So the difference with positive externalities is that there is an under-allocation of resources towards their consumption or production. So think about vaccinations for a moment, and again, wind back your 2024 thinking in the sense that, well, vaccines are government subsidized, or they are directly provided by the government, or in some cases I'm mandated to take the vaccine. Take COVID-19 as an example, right? None of that exists in this market. This is the market for vaccinations without any government intervention. And what we're saying at Q1 is that there is an under allocation of resources towards this market. And as a result, Q1 is too low. And because Q1 is too low, it implies that not enough of the vaccine is being consumed. And maybe that's because the price is too high. We're not sure, but at the end of the day, we're concerned with what's happening on the x-axis, and we're saying that Q1 is too low. And so what can we do? What can the government do? They might have some policies they can use to shift the supply curve to the right, or potentially shift the demand curve to the left. Either of those outcomes will create a new equilibrium point where the new Q that is associated with those equilibrium points is higher than Q1. All right. So we'll use vaccinations as an example. Here is how the government could address it. Number one, subsidies. Okay. So the government can provide subsidies to vaccine producers to reduce their cost of production. That shifts the supply curve to the right. That leads to a decrease in price and an increase in quantity. And ultimately, that's going to encourage consumption because suddenly the product becomes more affordable for everyday people like you and me. The other thing the government can do is directly provide the product. So rather than focusing on the free market providing the product, rather than hoping that, market forces will do their thing, the government might just take it on and go, you know what, we're just going to produce the vaccines ourselves and we're going to sell them at a discounted rate, or we're just going to provide them for free to the public because we deem them to be positive externalities and we want to encourage an increase in their consumption. I've got in bracket here public schools, which are a great example of a positive externality of consumption. Obviously, we want all our young people to be educated, and in Australia, we have a great divide between public and private schools, and obviously private schooling is not accessible to everybody. So what does the government do? They recognise the positive externality of consumption and they directly provide public schools so that everybody has access to an education such that they can obviously go on and contribute, to society once they cross into adulthood. And the last one, everyone's favourite, research and development. So we're talking about positive externalities of production. We're talking about encouraging private companies to engage in things such as R&D because they do have such a benefit to society. But we recognise that without any type of government intervention, the incentives to engage meaningfully in R&D are obviously a little bit skewed, such that there is an under-allocation of resources towards research and development. So once again, guys, positive externality, in this case of production, under allocation, Q1 is too low. So what happens here? Once again, the government might come in and subsidise those businesses that choose to engage in R&D. They might have a bunch of criteria that need to be met, but they basically say, righto, if your company's going to engage in R&D, we will provide you with some money that you can then allocate towards that pursuit to help reduce your costs of production. That shifts the supply of R&D to the right and encourages an increase in the production of research and development. And the other one is direct government provision. The best example in Australia is the CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. This is a government body that is designed specifically to engage in R&D, particularly in the scientific fields. So rather than relying on the private sector to engage, the government has decided to have this body that basically engages in a whole bunch of scientific research on its behalf. And then as and when discoveries are made, those are then, dished out to the private sector such that they can take those discoveries and use them going forward to benefit society. So once again, guys, two solutions that both allow for Q1 to shift from Q1 to Q2 such that the under allocation of resources is addressed. And that is externalities. I hope that's making sense, guys. If you've got any questions, please reach out.